Well, welcome everybody and all the crowds out there that are looking at this meeting. You reckon?
Well, there's a small crowd.
Small crowd, you think so? Okay, item one on the, welcome to the Standards Committee, October 29th, Tuesday, 6 o'clock. Apologies, the first item. I've had apologies from Councillor Hassel, Councillor Ingle and Alistair Davis.
Yes, that's right, Chair, yeah, correct.
The monitoring officer also sends her apologies. She's away this week, unfortunately.
Well, we allow her to go on holiday occasionally. Item 2 is late items. I don't have any late items to add in. Item 3 is declarations of interest. Does anybody have any declarations of interest? Do I have to declare anything with the pink paper?
Depends on the nature of the discussion later, so you can make a declaration later.
I'm going to give you a tough time, you know, now you're taking their place. Okay, so no declarations of interest. Thank you very much. Item 4 is the minutes of the meeting on the 6th of August. Can I take them as a true record? Thank you very much. Item 5 is the Standards Committee forward plan. The recommendation is to add any additional items or make alterations to the forward plan for future consideration by the Standards Committee. Does anybody have any additional items they wish to add?
Chair, I've added in the items that were mentioned at the last meeting, so I added those into the forward plan. There were a few, Alex raised a few and members did as well.
Can you remind us what they are? Because it seems such a long time ago since we met.
Yeah, absolutely. So, as you said, Chair, it is the standard report that allows the committee to place items in the report for planned future meetings. Just to note that the report of the Complaints Procedure Working Group that's listed on the forward plan is on the agenda for this evening.
Okay.
Also intending to bring an update on work to produce a councillor training and development strategy to the next meeting in January. That work's ongoing at the moment. I know at the previous meeting we discussed the various codes and protocols that this committee is responsible for overseeing and when you would like to next see them brought back to the committee. They're on the forward plan but without dates assigned to them yet. If anyone would like to make any suggestions to what order they come back in, happy to bring those back to future meetings for discussion and consideration.
What meeting do we have after January?
18th of March, Chair.
March. We bring it to the March.
Yeah, absolutely. That's fine.
We don't want to stress and overburden councillors and independent members with too much reading.
Especially as it's Christmas.
Sorry?
Especially as it's Christmas.
Absolutely. Okay. So are we happy to accept them recommendations? Thank you very much. Item 6, the Councillor Complaints Procedure Working Group. And this is one of the biggest items on the agenda. I'm just trying to find the beginning of it. There we go. All right, so this has come from. Do you want to talk on this?
Yeah,
I've got some questions.
Absolutely, Chair. Yeah, of course. So this report presents the findings of the working group that was established by the Standards Committee in December of last year to consider issues around the extensive disclosure of information about complaints and also the nature of informal resolutions that are agreed as part of the councillor complaints procedure. As many of you will be aware already, the working group was comprised of representatives of each political group, the group whips in most instances, or for groups that don't have whipping arrangements, the group leaders, and also the 4 independent persons who were appointed to the Standards Committee and representatives of the monitoring officer, myself and Stephen Mason. The group met on 3 occasions over the course of that period to discuss the issues that were originally referred from the Standards Committee. They reviewed some benchmarking information collected from other councils at their first meeting, and then at their subsequent meetings they considered proposed amendments to the procedures. And to the extent that we reached a position relatively recently that the group felt they were able to recommend a set of changes back to the Standards Committee. The outcome of that work is presented at Appendix 1 to the report. So there is an updated councillor complaints procedure with some proposed changes highlighted in yellow. The key changes include a distinction being made between informal resolutions that are reached at the earlier stages of the complaints procedure and what is described in the procedure as a local resolution, which is reached after an investigator has identified there had likely been a breach of the code of conduct. The working group generally felt that there was a distinction to be made between a councillor who accepted wrongdoing at the very earliest stages of the complaints procedure and took appropriate steps to resolve the issue either through an apology or a requirement to undertake training, compared to a situation where perhaps a complaint has progressed through an investigation and then, as a means to avoid a hearing, seek an informal resolution at a much later stage. So the proposals now make a distinction between those two circumstances. Introduced as well is a basic level of disclosure for the outcome of all complaints that are considered under the procedure by a table that is proposed to be published on the Democracy Portal, so part of the council's website, and then routinely reviewed by this committee as part of its open session. And that basic level of disclosure would include information such as the date a complaint was received, whether the complaint was from a member of the public, an officer or another councillor, the paragraphs from the code of conduct that were alleged to have been breached, the nature of any resolution that's agreed as part of that complaint. So all complaints would have that basic level of disclosure. The proposals also include an enhanced level of disclosure for complaints that have been resolved via a local resolution, i.e. after an investigation or upheld by a hearing of the Standards Committee. So in those circumstances, a councillor would be named, and also the working group recommended that the cost to the council and to the taxpayer of the investigatory process was published as part of the decision notice of that complaint. Also, an additional appendix is included in the procedure that details the circumstances in which the monitoring officer might seek to reach an informal or a local resolution. So taken from some guidance that's produced by the Local Government Association, the procedure lists circumstances in which it may be appropriate to seek that type of resolution, and importantly also circumstances in which it may not be. It also sets out the steps required by the monitoring officer to consult with both the complainant and the subject member on any proposed resolution before it is agreed. And then also, I know this has been a matter of discussion for this committee for a long period of time. It was agreed that there should be a standing entitlement for councillor members of the Standards Committee to ask questions when in private session about how informal and local resolutions were reached. So hopefully resolving that issue we've discussed previously, where there's that imbalance between information that is provided to IPs and officers involved with administering the process and councillor members of the Standards Committee. In addition to that, the working group did feel that it was not appropriate for the Standards Committee to ask questions about live complaints, given that there is always that potential for the Standards Committee to form the hearings panel at the end of a complaints process. So it would represent a conflict of interest for councillor members of the Standards Committee to be involved in discussion of how a complaint should be handled, given that they may ultimately be the arbiters of how that complaint is resolved at the end of the process. The working group also proposed 2 amendments that fell outside of the scope of the original recommendation that was made by the Standards Committee, but generally speaking, these were supported by officers as sensible additions to the procedures. These were firstly the inclusion of an introductory paragraph at the start of the procedure that outlines the scope and purpose of the complaints procedure, includes some information about the role of the monitoring officer in that procedure, and also clarification that allegations of criminal conduct would always be referred to the police. The working group looked at several different complaints procedures used by different local authorities, and many of them included reference to circumstances in which criminal conduct was reported to the standards through the standards process. Now, in those circumstances, we would always refer that to the police, and the council has no jurisdiction to investigate that type of thing, and it is better handled by the police. So it's important to make that clear. Thankfully, in my experience, we've never had that situation arise here in Derby, but it's not beyond the realms of possibility. The second amendment that's proposed that sort of falls outside of the scope of the original request from the Standards Committee was that the sanctions that are available to a hearings panel are not explicitly listed in the Appendix F, which is the hearings procedure to within the substantive complaints procedure. So what we've done is we have listed the sanctions that are available to a hearings panel when considering a complaint, and they reflect the sanctions that were adopted by the council when the core elements of this current standards regime was adopted, and that was in May 2018. So the amendments are presented today to the Standards Committee by the working group for comments, and amendment if necessary, but if approved, they would require subsequent referral to the full council to be adopted. It's not something that falls within the terms of reference of this committee. In my personal opinion, I think that they are a proportionate and sensible set of additions to the procedure that address some of the comments and issues that councillors have discussed at this previously, particularly about the extent of disclosure and the basis for informal and local resolutions. So I'm happy to take questions on the amendments to the procedure and seek the views of the committee, and hopefully, if the recommendations are adopted, make a referral through to full council.
Anybody got any questions?
No questions, Chair. Just to say, I think it's appropriate, for committee the changes that have been proposed. Probably, I think the committee itself were talking about it a couple of years ago. Some of these, so I welcome them, and I think they're sensible and appropriate.
Thank you. Any independent members? No. Okay, I've got a few questions. So you just talked about the working group. Have they seen these alterations?
Yes.
They've seen all these alterations and they're,
Yes.
they're quite happy with it. Okay. So can on the first page, it's Appendix 1, that's the main issue. On Appendix 1, on the first page, it says here that the monitoring officer will consider the request made by the complainant to protect their identity. This will only be allowed in exceptional circumstances. Can you explain what exceptional means?
I can, Chair. I would point out that is not an area of the procedure that the working group have been looking at.
No.
The areas highlighted in yellow are
No, but these are just things that I've picked up.
There may be circumstances, I suppose, when the safety of the complainant might be considered relevant, and in those circumstances, the monitoring officer might agree to a request from a complainant that their identity was withheld. I would say, based on previous experience, there is a high bar for that to be agreed. I think it's a basic issue of natural justice that anyone who is accused of something knows who's accusing them. And so there has to be a really significant reason why a identity would be withheld. It is sometimes requested, but I think that I can't recall a recent complaint where the identity of the complainant has been withheld from the subject member. In most cases, that request is refused because the reasons given aren't robust enough.
Okay, so I'll ignore that question. On number 10, it says the independent advisory panel will be made aware of the complaint. Can you, and that they would, this is on the assessment, the monitoring officer initial consideration. It says it's the monitoring officer assessment stage. Mm-hmm. Can you tell me of any instance where the independent person advisory panel have gone against the monitoring officer's recommendation?
In practice, it's the other way around, in that the monitoring officer consults with the independent person advisory panel, and they offer their opinion and their views, and then based on those opinions, the monitoring officer makes a decision as to whether to escalate the complaint to the subsequent stage. Independent persons don't always agree with one another. They sometimes offer contradictory views, and it's for the monitoring officer to weigh up those views and make a reasonable determination.
Can I ask the independent? You've been through some of these, haven't you?
Yes.
Yeah. Right. Is that correct? Is the monitoring officer
does a complaint without any advice or recommendations from the monitoring officer?
That's good.
So we then send in our views, which do differ.
Okay, that's all I wanted to see, because I'm looking at influence here.
We don't consult each other. We just.
Oh, that's right.
Put
Okay.
our views forward.
Yes.
All right. So that suggests that you know about that. It also says here on number 21 that the monitoring officer shall determine the outcome in consideration of the independent person's advice, which suggests that the monitoring officer could overrule that recommendation.
Yes.
I'm not necessarily keen on that. It's also in investigation, item 29, it says that they may appoint a suitably qualified external investigator. Do you think this is a good use of the resources? Does the committee think that's a good use of resources, that they can consider doing that, particularly in the situation that we are in our budget, when we actually have professional officers in the council that are very capable of doing that job? Councillor.
I have to agree with that, Chair, because I think we've got enough people and enough resources here to without spending any more money on complaints sometimes doesn't even go anywhere. I think we've got enough capability with the officers here to deal with the in-house instead of having to restructure and send it somewhere else. I mean, we've got guys on the independents that are pretty good at what they're doing. So why we need to outsource it is, to me, I think that's just a waste of time and a waste of money, especially in the current climate we're in.
Well, in practice, it doesn't happen very often. But I mean, there could be circumstances where it couldn't be done internally because of various factors that has happened. I mean, Alex would probably.
I'm happy to offer a view, but I know you asked the committee for their opinions, Chair.
Well, yeah, I know what your view is. You've written it down.
It's difficult to remember specific cases, but there has been cases where it was thought that it couldn't be done internally because people were implicated or could be implicated.
Yeah. I mean, the reason I'm asking the question,
it can be very expensive, and I think it should always be avoided if possible.
Yes, absolutely, it should always be avoided. But I've got experience of this, you see. So this is why, had I not had experience, it would be more difficult for me to give a judgment on it. But considering what the committee can impose on a councillor, there is nothing that it can impose on a councillor.
Mm.
Do we need to be spending any money outside of the council on something where the where their judgment is not worth the paper it's written on, to be quite frank?
It probably goes back to that exceptional circumstances thing again.
Yeah, probably. Okay, but that was just my that was just something. I don't know if anybody else.
I can offer an opinion if you wish, Chair.
Yep.
I think it's not a question of capability; it's a question of capacity within the council. There are individuals who are capable of carrying out those investigations, but they can be incredibly time-consuming and inevitably divert resources away from frontline services. And the other question is around, as Alan has pointed out, around exceptional circumstances, the severity of allegations. There are all the potential for conflict of interest where officers may be implicated in the circumstances that have given rise to a complaint. It's pretty common practice across the sector for external investigators to be commissioned. I do accept the point that they're expensive and resources are limited. I think one thing that councils could potentially look to do, and we might be well placed to explore, is reciprocal arrangements with other councils, because every council is required to have a monitoring officer, to have at least one independent person, and it may be that officers from a neighbouring authority could investigate complaints and vice versa. So that's something that I will be happy to take away and discuss with colleagues in the region. We are part of a working group of governance and monitoring officer professionals in the area, so it might be something we could explore.
To address that, I think we should have an idea of the cost. So if there's some past examples where we could know the cost.
I can provide that information to the committee at a future meeting. Yeah.
Sorry, Councillor Khan.
Yeah, I mean, I think we should look at the costs of it, and I mean, neighbouring authorities. Yes, I think it's probably better than spending money outside, but we have to be aware. I mean, you mentioned that sort of diverting human resource, if you like, from frontline services. Now, if they send it to us, then that will be similar, won't it? That our officer will have to divert the attention from frontline services and then look at the case. So it wouldn't necessarily, save time, but it may save money. And let's have a look at the cost of sort of a reasonable or mid-size sort of investigation cost from an outside body, and then look at our office's time and whether we could benefit by sharing it with other authorities. I personally would like to see it shared with other authorities rather than go to outside bodies who don't necessarily know the procedural matters. And I mean, they can read it, but do they actually know the workings of it? There's things that happen between officers, between councillors and officers, or councillors that in the heat of the moment, occur, but it's not common practice. And these outside investigators don't necessarily know that.
That's the point, Councillor Alex. Thanks, Chair. Councillor Conn just said, I think we're better off sharing our paper with another authority because they know the makeup of what we do on a day-to-day basis and what you guys go through. And I think going to somebody who's going to be an outsourcer, they're just going to charge us a book for just the sake of that's what they do as a profession, where neighbouring authorities kind of have all of them people in place to look at it and save us a fortune of money. So I agree with what you say, Councillor Conn, because I think it's common sense and it's the way forward.
Also, I'd like to just add in, because the front line's been mentioned twice now, and I would argue that that's probably a red herring from this local authority, because the people that are asked to be investigators, I would argue, are not frontline staff. They are management staff who run frontline staff. So, let's not get into the emotive bit that we're taking the carers away from individuals in their homes. We're not. We're talking about people that sit behind desks and do their job on a computer mostly. So, and as far as I can see, that we've got quite a lot of those people in the local authority. They don't necessarily have to come from democratic services or have a legal background. They just have to have of a managerial level. And I would assume that if somebody's good enough to be a manager, then they're good enough to because they'll have their own issues within their departments that they've got to manage. So I don't see that they would have any problem in dealing with that. So I just think we need to be careful using frontline services as a reason why we don't do it. I just think that's a bit of a red herring. The other thing is I couldn't see, and because if I just go to the very beginning, this committee, usually because of me, has always argued about the naming of people. Now, I still find it very difficult to understand why the officers in this committee and the independent members in this committee know who the complaints are about, but the members of the committee don't. And I still find that an oddity. Because we've been elected to do this particular job, and I don't understand why there is a difference between people that attend this committee. So you mentioned that there are some changes in there, but I couldn't read where those changes were, and I couldn't I didn't really understand how those changes affect how the workings of this committee work. Councillor Conn.
I know you've raised this before and I've argued against it, and my stance is still the same. There is absolutely no benefit to elected member to learn the name of either a complainant or the subject member. We look at what's in front of us. The name should not be material to what's happened. And then you will open up a can of worms by, for argument's sake, I'm representing a Labour group. You're sort of Reform, Adjits, Lib Dem, and if Steve Hassel was here, I could say, well, there was 3 of them ganged up on me. Or a subject member could say, that it was unfair because I was this. But so there is absolutely nothing to gain, but a lot to lose in terms of us being seen to be fair.
Okay, well, I respect your view. I just disagree with it. I think that we're all adults here, and we've all got a responsibility. It's just a case of councillor such and such was reported for this. We, at the very early stages, and I listened to Alex very carefully. We are not allowed to comment on live complaints. But the fact that we don't know what the complaints are about or who they're about is ridiculous in my view.
I would argue with that to a certain extent. We do know what the complaint is about, and as you said, we're responsible adults, and I think we should be able to make our minds up from the information supplied. The name should not matter.
You were going to show me.
Yeah, Chair, if I can pick up that point around what changes that is being proposed by this report. It's from paragraph 38 onwards around the extent of disclosure. So this question was specifically considered by the working group, and the working group's view was that it was agreeing with the position that you've adopted, that it's entirely appropriate for members of the standards, council members of the standards committee, who have the same level of access to information as independent persons and officers when talking about complaints that had made their way through the process and been resolved. What the group felt was that, given the potential for future involvement in a hearing, it wasn't appropriate to get into the weeds, for want of a better description, of complaints before it had reached that stage. In terms of paragraphs 38 onwards, what is being proposed is that a table would be available on the council's website that would show the status of all complaints received over a given municipal year and some basic information about when that complaint was received, whether that complaint had been received from a councillor, a member of the public or an officer, the paragraphs within the code of conduct that were alleged to have been breached, and then as it made its way through the procedure, it will be updated to show its latest status and the nature of any outcome that was agreed. So that would be the basic information that was provided to the public and then discussed in the open session of this meeting routinely. Beyond that, there is then an additional level of disclosure for complaints where an investigator has found that there had likely been a breach of the code of conduct and the subject member had sought to reach an informal resolution or local resolution. So that would involve the councillor being named. And equally, as is the case currently, if a hearing finds a councillor in breach of the code of conduct, they would also be named in those circumstances as well. The key change is that the group felt there should be more of a dialogue between councillor members of the Standards Committee, IPs and officers in the private part of the meeting to look at complaints that have made their way through the process, because then that allows the committee to fulfil its broader remit to look for trends and patterns, things that are working in the procedure, things that aren't working in the procedure, and recommend future amendments to council for adoption. Just to touch on the point around full disclosure, I suppose, if we were to release all information into the public domain, as we've said at this committee before, that is a matter for councillors to agree. It is within your gift to agree that. If we have a responsibility as officers and as the council, as the data controllers, to protect the identity, the personal information of complainants in some circumstances, but as public individuals, if you wish to disclose the names of all councillors who are accused of anything under the complaints procedure, that is within your gift. What I would suggest, and this is my advice for you to take on board, is that over the course of the year, we receive lots of complaints, and many of them there is no evidence to support them. Some are entirely spurious, but if they were to be released into the public domain, and I mean no disrespect to our local press or people who operate online, we know that that information would immediately be put into the public domain, and whether a councillor was guilty or otherwise, it could have a really significant reputational impact for them. And yet, when the complaint progressed through the process, there was no evidence to substantiate it, and it would have been dismissed. Now, if that is a risk that, as a group of councillors, you are prepared to accept, then you can choose to place that information in the public domain. This matter has been debated at the Standards Committee for a long time, and I think in the report that's later on the agenda, Stephen has set out the times when the committee has been asked to vote on it, and on each occasion the Standards Committee has agreed to keep the current level of disclosure around naming councillors. That's my advice to you as a committee, but it is within your gift as councillors to make that decision.
Thank you for that, Alex. I totally agree. I think we're not going to be doing ourselves any favours by naming the shame, because sometimes the complaints don't go anywhere. And even by putting it on the website on the table, I don't think we need to be doing that. They come to us as a standards committee. We've got independent members on there who guide and advise us of how we should be looking at it. And I think it should be kept internal to save us any real embarrassment, because sometimes, like you said, the frivolous, 9 times out of 10, nothing really comes of that complaint. The press will pick up on anything, because when there's nothing happening in the press, they need a story. And do we really want to be, as a council, embarrassing ourselves? And because, they're, again, finger pointing, these guys like kids in the playground. We don't want that, and I wouldn't accept that, because it's just, we'd be causing ourselves further embarrassment, and I don't think it's necessary. You may agree or disagree, but that's just my opinion. I think we've got enough in the committee to do with it ourselves without having to name and shame and make a big song and dance about it.
Just for clarification, Councillor, what is being proposed in terms of the level of basic disclosure wouldn't include the councillor's name.
Okay.
So could you just repeat that?
So when I mentioned that we would publish a table on the democracy portal that includes some basic information about all complaints, that wouldn't include the councillor's name. It would include the information it would provide would be whether the subject member was either a councillor, an officer, or a member of the public.
Well, going back to the idea of, I think you were saying is, perhaps full disclosure at the committee meeting, the standards committee.
No. It's my issue. If I can clarify, my issue is we have pink papers that are garbage. It means they say nothing, they mean nothing. They could, one of the storytellers could have written them all, because we don't know who he is, what they've done. All we have is a generic thing. What I'm saying is we should be trusted with the pink papers to say councillor such and such was had a complaint against about this, not in detail, just about whatever. All right.
So
the pink papers are still private.
The nature of
the only time you should name them is when it's been proved that they've done something wrong, as it is at the moment.
So are you talking about the name of the subject, or the complainant, or both, or I'm not
well actually what this is suggesting is a halfway house. What it's suggesting in here is that if it's found that there is a reasonable case for a complaint, then at that point they name the councillor, and I accept that, because there's a lot of spurious complaints that come through, and if there's no basis of that complaint, we don't need to know who they are anyway. But if they're written in a report, even in the pink papers, we should know what it's about. You know what it's about. These two know what it's about, but we don't.
Is there not a case of?
But we shouldn't be even allowed to comment on it. It's just a report to say we've had 10 complaints this month. This person's been complained about. This person's been complained about, and that's it. I don't see the purpose of not doing that. Other local authorities do it, and they don't have a problem.
So you'd have it in the pink papers, but you're saying you wouldn't be able to discuss it.
Well, you're not allowed to anyway.
Well, this is some of the things are changing, isn't it? And we can
no, what it's
things.
No, I don't think so. I think
things on the pink papers that we've already decided.
From what I understand is it stays in the pink papers unless they've been proved to have done something wrong. Even keeping in the pink papers if the councillor apologises, which is fine.
I think that the nature of the change is to be able to discuss things that have been, they've gone through the process and either been dismissed or they've been ratified. So,
well, if they've been dismissed, that's fine.
That's correct. So what is being proposed here is that, and this is what the working group's recommendation was that when we get to the pink papers on at standards committee, you as councillor members of the standards committee could ask questions about complaints that had been resolved, and that can include information about the name of the subject member and where appropriate details of the provided it doesn't breach any sort of data protection rules, information about the nature of the complaint, how it was that maybe the monitoring officer reached an informal resolution, how that resolution was appropriate and proportionate to the allegations. Those discussions, that is what the working group has recommended, that those types of discussions can take place at and under the exempt business of the committee, which, to remind councillors, obviously when business is discussed under exempt session, clearly the code of conduct places an obligation on anyone who is in receipt of that information not to publicly disclose it. What is not being recommended is that you as potentially the jury in a hearing of a complaint is provided with all of that information before it reaches that stage, because you need to be, if you are participating in that hearings panel at the end of a complaints process, you need to be approaching that process in a open and fair way that hasn't been swayed by any previous discussion that might have taken place at this committee.
Isn't there a case where we might actually have to change the whole complaints procedure if you allowed that level of disclosure about live complaints, because it could, the independents themselves might not have even had they may not even have had the details of that.
Can I just come and I think what the chair's asking about is just everybody else seems to know the complaints and they know the subject, but the elected members. That's it.
I just feel, it's been debated many times before. The arguments for and against remain the same, and it just seems pointless going over and over it again. I mean, it may be a case that, yes, the name is disclosed in the pink papers to 5 councillors here, and if it's leaked out, then we'll all be looking at each other, blaming each other, right? So I just don't see the benefit to us of having a name disclosed. We want information, and yeah, you're right. Maybe we should have a bit more information, but I just, for the life of me, can't understand, why the name is more important than the actual circumstances.
I think just for clarity, I think the reason I say that is if you look at today's pink papers, I'm not going to talk about it. Most of them don't mean anything, and we are a committee that are supposed to pass this paper, and yet we don't know most of us don't know what it's about. All right. So what is our function if we don't understand the information?
And these changes to the procedure are seeking to address that. We have specifically asked that question of the working group. This was one of the two key tenets of the things that we asked them to look at. And their recommendation is that there's an additional level of disclosure provided to council members of the Standards Committee in private section about complaints that have been resolved, but that confidentiality is maintained for complaints that are live. That was their view. You as a committee can consider that and make recommendations as you wish. So that was the view of the cross-party working group that also involved the IP.
Do you know what the procedure for other authorities in and around the UK regarding their procedure?
We've done benchmarking. As part of this work, we did benchmarking against other comparator authorities. I can't tell you off the top of my head what other councils' procedures are line by line, but we have benchmarked our procedure against several other councils. And I'm satisfied that our procedures is entirely consistent with standard practice in local government. There may be councillors who differ and councils that differ in some ways, and I can't sit here and say that no standards committee isn't provided that type of information. But the purpose of this working group was to look at this question, and this is the response that they have provided.
Okay, I think we've had a long discussion about that. We've got 2 recommendations here. Are we happy with those recommendations? Yeah. Okay. That's good. That passed.
Usually supposed to be dragging time at 7 o'clock.
Is that right? It's not. The thing is, I know in my own mind that if I've said what I need to say, and you are obviously on the side of keep your name out of it because you don't want to be told everybody to know that what your wrongdoings. Whereas I think if I've done something wrong, I'd rather everybody know it. We're just on different sides of the fence there. Okay, item 7 is the volume and outcome of councillor complaints. You want to say anything about it?
Yes, Chair. So this is a standing report that presents the latest figures for the volume and outcome of councillor complaints received during the current municipal year. The committee will note that actually no complaints have been received during the current municipal year, which is a real improvement on where we were same time last year.
Sorry, 0 complaints.
So 0 complaints since the annual meeting.
That's either because there's no elections coming or people are bored.
I wouldn't wish to comment, Chair.
Or do they want to make up stories like you, Chair?
Obviously,
that's true.
Over the course of the last municipal year, there were 19 complaints received in total. Some of those about the same issue, but that is a significant improvement. 7 of those 19 complaints from the last municipal year were carried over from into 24-25. Since May, 5 of those have either been dismissed or resolved by way of an informal resolution, and there'll be an opportunity to go through some of the detail of that in the session. So details of the remaining 2 live complaints are detailed at item 9, and obviously I'll have to take questions on the volume and outcome of complaints, but I'd ask that any detail is reserved until we enter the private session.
Anybody got any questions? Are you happy to note that report?
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Right, item 8, switch the TV off. Sorry. Exclusion of the press and public. To consider a resolution to exclude the press and public during consideration of the following items. That under section 100A of the Local Government Act and secrecy, no, sorry, not that bit. The press and public will be excluded from the meeting during discussion of the following items on the grounds that they may involve the likely disclosure of exempt information or unlikely information defined in the paragraphs 1 and 2 of part 1 of Schedule 12A of the Act, and that the public interest in maintaining the exemption outweighs the public interest in disclosing the information.